Spencer Werther, and we're going to talk about what is strategy. I'm going to break this down into several elements so that we can cover the main parts of what that is. And as I go through these, I want you to understand that these are all related to each other. The first thing we want to talk about is strategy and its long-term big picture dynamic. In other words, the landscape in which strategy operates. The point we have here is that strategy needs to see how everything is related to everything in order for it to work within the landscape metaphor. The second part that I want to talk about is the difference between strategy and a tactic. People mix this up all the time, and we're going to separate that out for you so that you have that clear in your mind. The third part about this is we need to illustrate the need for broad and deep mastery before you can develop a strategy. The logic here is really quite simple. Unless you understand what you're integrating, there's no way that you're going to make any sense out of this. So those are the three main learning objectives that we have here. And the fourth one, is the holistic synthesis aspect of strategy. In other words, taking this to seeing and then surfing an emerging future. What I mean by surfing an emerging future is that you can go anywhere with a strategy that makes sense for you, but it has to be on the realistic environment that you're in. You can't just make things up. So let's talk about the strategy versus tactics part first. Strategy is about deciding where you're going to go and why. It's a plan of action. It's a policy designed for a major overall objective. If you think about this in terms of most academics, you have a strategy for a career plan, you have a strategy for a life plan, and there are particular kinds of things you have to do to get there. Tactics is deciding how to get there. It's the action plan, the specific things that you have to do to get there. Again, going back to an academic metaphor, you have a strategy to have a certain kind of life with a certain kind of degree. What particular steps do you have to do to achieve that end? So tactics is action and strategy is big picture. The last part here is strategy involves a longer-term assessment. It involves critical thinking about that longer-term assessment, whereas tactics involves the use of shorter-term operational assessments and critical thinking applied to that. These things, many of the same methods, but they're used for a different purpose, and I think I want to separate that out for you very clearly to think about that. The building of strategy requires a deep investigative mindset. In other words, you cannot simply pop things in and make them whatever you wish them to be. You have to understand how things work. And I use this little slide both because it's a little bit humorous, but also because that inquisitive mindset is absolutely necessary to understanding how things work, and you don't get anywhere without it. This mastering the landscape thinking involves the second part, which is dealing with complexity. This slide here is about a strategy designed for the Afghan war, and the problem with it is it's not a very good slide because it's too complicated. You can't understand the various pieces and how they work together, and therefore it fails as a strategic thinking tool. Strategy needs to simplify so you get the big picture, not every minute little aspect of it, but rather how the big picture works. Again, the surfing metaphor works. Where's the wave breaking? How's it breaking? How do I fit into that landscape so that I can surf the wave is more the mindset that we're trying to get to think about here. The deep investigative mindset is not about getting all the facts, and I want to emphasize this very clearly. You can't get all the facts. There's too many of the little things. You're going to get confused. So what you have to do is extract the facts that you need and use them in your thinking. That requires judgment. That requires understanding. We're going to get into that to some degree. It's also not about understanding every relationship in detail. I talked about that in the just prior slide. You have to use judgment and experience. And the two sources of, if you want to call it wisdom, is in fact judgment and experience. This is one of the reasons that many of these mathematical solution sets that we're getting fail. They fail partly because you don't have the judgment and experiential aspect to understand what the arithmetic is telling you. The last part is about mastering whole system dynamics and understanding how things work and how they're likely to unfold. Judging why this way and not another way is what's likely to emerge. Again, we're in the realm here of understanding, of wisdom, of judgment, not necessarily merely about facts. Now, you do this all the time. For example, when you drive, you're looking at the entire system as it's unfolding in front of you. You know the rules of the road. You know some of the things about how people drive, and you know where you want to go, hopefully. And so you put all that together, and so you understand how things are likely to unfold, and you design your strategy around that. The last thing I want to talk about here, in the introductory part of this, is your prior tempo classes should have fostered some of that deep knowledge about several fields. What we're asking both tactics and strategy is the integration of those. So we taught you Integrative Business Applications, BA 3103, which was supposed to have an operational and tactical focus. In other words, how do you combine the various kinds of operational things to get to where you want to go? The BA 4101 teaches investigative or synthetic strategic thinking skills tied around strategic management focus. This is the big picture part, and the logic here is you understand how the little pieces work, and then you apply them to the large picture thinking. You could do it the other way around. In reality, they're iterative. They go back and forth with each other. So we've tried to set this up for you so you can actually do it. And the last, you have to do the first two to do the last. Okay, in other words, you need the deep knowledge, you need the applications before you can do the strategy. That goes back to my initial point that you have to know something before you can actually integrate it. So think about the classes you've had, the experiences you've had, and how those would tie into a sound strategic judgment, and you're on the right path. You also have to know your operational capabilities. This slide here, again, slightly comedic, is a cat getting away from three dogs who'd like to catch the cat. To have a strategy that you can't do is not a good strategy. You need to be able to actually execute this thing. Again, that ties back to the 3103. How do you integrate the operational aspect of this before you can think about the kind of strategy that you want? And then, again, surfing the change, the emerging future comes from somewhere, goes from somewhere, and most of my talks to corporate executives and government officials, I use the surfing metaphor, as have another number of other people. It's a very good metaphor because you can go anywhere on that wave that you have the skill to go, but you can only go on that wave. So when you look at the large environment that you're operating in, there are things you can do and there are things you can't do, and you have to know the difference. These skills require also knowing internals, your firm, what it's capable of, and externals, competitors, and the external environment. That has to be firmly in your mind. You can't design a good strategy if you don't know what your firm is capable of and what it wants to do, as opposed to not knowing the externals, what your competitors are capable of doing and what they want to do, and the changes in the large external environment. Moving from static thinking to dynamic thinking is also a part of this. What we want you to do is see what things are capable of becoming and likely to become and capable of acting. This is complicated, and I think I need to say something here which most of you won't welcome. This comes with experience and with age. Strategic thinking is actually one of the few things in futures thinking. It's one of the few things that get better with age. The research on this basically says people really start to get this around age 35 or so, and they're unlikely to get it before then, as opposed to, say, some fields like mathematics where people are geniuses at 18 or 19, or chess playing, same thing. That's not true in strategic thinking. So what we're really doing here is setting the foundation for a skill which will mature with age and with experience as you get older. And then the last part here is the integrative synthetic thinking abilities are born of this experience. They yield insights and intuitions. Albert Einstein famously said that intuition is nothing but prior intellectual experience, so that when you put these things together, you have sound instincts, sound judgments, sound insights and intuitions about what will and will not work and why it will or will not work in a particular kind of way. So that's what we're after here. Strategy, I want to emphasize, is about the future, and I have here two slides about different futures. One is a high-tech, very attractive-looking future. The other one is sort of a dystopian future. You have to therefore have some judgments about the future is going to be. In my work, which is heavily involved in futures foresight and forecasting, I generally stay within the 5-year realm because I don't think the science is there to come up with good forecasts into the 10 to 20-year and 30-year realm, which means a strategy is probably going to be designed for the relatively near term. 5 years if you're very brave, 10 years, but beyond that I think you're guessing, and it's hard to do. So think about that also. What is it you're capable of foreseeing in the future in your particular field with those particular technologies, and that's what you build your strategy around. Being able to act in that future, some of the elements of building an advantage of preservation of choice and not doing certain kinds of things is absolutely central. You can think about this again in terms of academics. There are certain kinds of things that you want to emphasize and certain kinds of things that you don't want to emphasize if you're trying to get a job. The same thing goes with strategy. There are certain things in the company you want to emphasize, other things you don't want to emphasize, and you have to know the difference. So too is building and having the capacity to execute these advantageous activities in an integrated manner. This is synthesis. Now you do this naturally if you cook. You take a bunch of elements, the raw ingredients into the cake you're baking or the dinner you're producing, and those elements begin to merge into the final product. The same thing happens with the disciplines that we're talking about, whether it be accounting or finance or marketing, political science, economics, sociology, psychology. Separately, those things do not yield a good strategy. They have to become integrated. They have to become merged into some final view which takes these as a whole and not as disparate parts. Harvard's Michael Porter, who's one of the more famous professors out there, emphasizes that strategy is establishing a difference that you can preserve. In other words, a strategy has to last you for a relatively longer period of time. It's not something that you change every few minutes or every few years even. The essence of strategy is choosing to perform activities differently than rivals do, according to Mr. Porter, and this is an important thing. That yields the sort of comparative advantage or the niche that makes you better than somebody else at doing something. So you have to think about what it is you're going to do that's better than everybody else does it. And it's also about deciding what you don't do. I just talked about that, positioning yourself for trade-offs so that you have essentially a strategy that's going to work. What we're talking about here is if you decide to go to college, you cannot at the same time primarily build a career at maximum potential. You've decided to forego building the career to some degree so that you can go to college. If you have a longer term strategy, you're going to decide to do some things and not do others. A common one is people put off getting married, having a family, those kinds of things, because they want to work on building their career, or they might decide to do it the other way around. It varies, but it's up to you. But you're going to have these trade-offs, and you need to think about those. And then combining all these activities, it's the same thing I talked about earlier. It doesn't work unless they're all combined in some solid kind of way. So here's some quotes. Okay, this is from Sun Tzu, Chinese philosopher and an expert on the art of war, and he basically says the following: if you know your enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, and for every victory you'll have a defeat, and if you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb to every battle. Many of the points I talked about prior are captured in this, which is why I put it there. Confucius, also Chinese, said the study of the past, if you would define the future, what he's talking about here is the future emerges from the past just like a wave emerges from a prior state of that wave, and that kind of thinking is very good forecasting and futures-oriented thinking kind of behavior. And then Clausewitz, a German philosopher of war, in fact a lot of strategic thinking comes from war, says there are very few people, and they are the exceptions, who are able to think and feel beyond the present moment. Most people, and this includes people in government, people in the corporate sector, in my view, spend too much time thinking about the present moment and the very, very near term. The critique of going quarter to quarter thinking is of that type. We've also seen for the intelligence community the crisis of the moment kind of thinking. That is the enemy of good strategy. You have to think about beyond the present moment. Where's this leading? Why is it going in that direction? What do you want to do about it, if anything? So those are some quotes. Another one is that all strategies, you can see the tactics, but you can't really see the strategy. Sun Tzu points this out, and I think that is also correct. The tactics are the operational aspects that you see. How they fit together is a lot harder to figure out, and therefore a good strategy is a little bit opaque from your opposition, and you want to keep it that way if you can. Napoleon talks about this. I put this quote in because I think it's a very good one about tactics. Never interrupt an enemy when he's making a mistake. Seems like sound advice. You might want to think about that too. And tactics means what you can with what you have. So Alinsky, that's the point about capability. There's no reason to have a tactic or a strategy if you can't execute it and actually do the thing that you're trying to do. And then 9/10 of tactics are certain and taught in books. The irrational tenth is like a kingfisher flashing across a pond. T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. What he's talking about here is some of this is insight, it's intuition. It comes together in a flash, and that is the part of that insight that fits to the other parts, which are the sort of strategic, the scientific aspects of this, the empirical aspects of this. And I think the two cannot be separated. You need to do that. So summing. Strategy requires prefatory, deep, and broad knowledge, and one of the things I'm going to suggest to you here, whatever your major, learn something about something else, because if you can have insight about 3 or 4 or 5 different fields, that is what you need to put things together to form a good strategy. Nobody has a strategy about just one field of study, so no matter how good you are at whatever it is you're doing, you need to think about how this ties to other areas. You can think about this: what business operates in an environment that has no political or regulatory impacts or no legal impacts? What business operates in an environment that has no social or psychological impacts? And you get the point. And the environment is evolving, it's changing. Therefore, you have to think about where things are going and why they're going that way. If you can foresee this, you're in really great shape. Some companies have done a very good job of this, some do a very miserable job of this. I won't get into specifics because we're taping. The strategy is also about this emerging future and being able to act effectively in it. So is your organization, your corporation, your company, or yourself capable of actually delivering in this emerging future? Again, the wave metaphor of surfing comes to the fore, If you're a good surfer, you can surf an awful lot of futures. If you're a bad surfer, you don't surf futures very well. And strategy involves integrating these many mindsets. The last 2 points, I think Warren Buffett has a very nice comment about this. He says, and when the tide goes out, you know who's been bathing naked. The idea here is you don't know who has a good strategy or a bad strategy until things start to go sideways. A good strategy negotiates difficult times well. A bad strategy is only good for fair weather days. And I think that's a big difference. These soft skills and hard skills combine. They're empirical, experiential, and intuitional, and they are tied to good judgment. No good judgment, none of this works. Judgment comes from experience, and good judgment comes from sound intuition. So that's where it comes from. So strategies being relatively long-term and sustainable, that's Mike Porter's notion, and that's correct. And I think good strategies work in good and bad weather. That's the Warren Buffett quote that I got ahead of myself on, but essentially that's also correct. So I think those are the things. All right, now sometimes, and I'm going to close with these, sometimes you just miss the boat. You get the timing wrong. That's the cartoon on the left. And the other one, you get strategies that you simply can't execute. The dinosaur here saying, I'll take care of those asteroids. No, you're not. Be the little mammal, run, live to fight another day. I think those are the things I want to talk about here. We've talked about each of these learning objectives, the long-term and short-term uses of landscape thinking, separated strategy from tactics. We've talked about the deep and broad mastery that's needed before you can develop a strategy, and I've emphasized that you absolutely need to study more than one field to be any good at this kind of thing. And then the holistic or synthesis aspects where you have to put this together so that you can see and eventually surf the emerging future, because if you don't do that, you're not going to be able to execute. Thanks for your time, and I hope you have a good future. Bye.